Chapter 2: The Great Property Development Game. One of the core powers of government is to establish private property rights in land. It is therefore no surprise that, quite literally, Australia's first James to play the game of mates shifted the power of government in his favour to snare highly valuable private property rights in land. It was the 22nd of February, 1790, when James Roos was granted Australia's first parcel of private land by Governor Arthur Phillip. His 30 acres, or 12 hectares, was recorded as number 1 on the Land Grants Register and sits in the heart of Parramatta. Born in Cornwall, England, and raised a farmer, James Roos came to the penal colony of New South Wales as a convict on the First Fleet in 1788. Roos lobbied for a release from his sentence and a land grant based on his farming abilities. Let me quote. Governor Phillip placed Roos, pending the receipt of the papers from England, upon an acre of cleared and prepared land on the right bank of the Parramatta River, where the town now stands. A hut was built for him, seeds, implements of agriculture, and a small quantity of livestock were provided, and he was allowed clothing and provisions for 12 months from the public store. As a spur to his industry, he was promised that if he behaved well, he would receive a grant of 30 acres on the site where his hut stood. End quote. And James did behave well in that year, for that was his only real choice. Like many games, what began as a socially beneficial trade, in this case land for farming services, evolved into a relationship where the discretion over the allocation of resources of society led to repeated favour exchanges. Governor Phillip's power came from being able to choose who was awarded land grants, when they were awarded, who was granted better lands, and their obligations to the colony. And he exercised that power by repeatedly granting James Roos the King's land free of charge. 5 years after arriving a prisoner, James sold the first 30 acres granted to him just 3 years earlier for £40. At the time, the average yearly wage of an adult male in England was about £26. A year later, in January 1794, James Roos was granted another 140 acres, or 57 hectares, by the governor. Then another 16 acres in June 1797. In early 1798, he sold these lands for £300, or about 11 years' wages for an English worker at the time. In 1819, then 60 years old, Roos obtained another grant of 100 acres, or 40 hectares, at Riverstone. Altogether, James was given about 20 years' wages in land value in his lifetime by the governor. In today's terms, that is about $1.6 million. While many other convicts received favourable land grants, they were given different parcels at different times with absolute discretion by the governor. Few got as much as James. Roos made the necessary moves to shift his alliance from the convicts, many of whom organised to undermine attempts by officers to establish order and plundered attempts at farming, to the officers, with years of work establishing trust through his good behaviour and farming skill. Many convicts later followed this path. These days, the task of signalling trust and reputation is more sophisticated, but fundamentally, the great property development game is the same. Property owners seek out favours for themselves above others. This can be in the form of local public investment, like roads and rail, that increases their property value, and rezoning decisions that provide them additional valuable property rights to develop to new uses. Before we look at the great property development game in the 21st century, let us take another brief diversion to 1911, just 10 years after Australia was established as a federation. The battle for the capital city was lost by both Sydney and Melbourne, and the quest for a new location for the nation's capital had begun. Melbourne had been through a major land boom and bust in the 1880s and 1890s, as had much of the Western world, an episode that led to a shift in thinking about land rights and their role in the rising inequality of the era. Thanks in part to charismatic American political economist Henry George, the the public had begun to question the coexistence of progress and poverty, and an influential political movement sprang up around George's call for a single tax on land to remove the unearned gains from land speculation. His argument was that since land rights are granted from the public at large, private owners should be obliged to rent land at market rates from the state, which can then share the wealth widely. This idea would come to influence how Australia's new capital city, Canberra, was funded, and how the land title system in the Australian Capital Territory would function for the next century. To fund the new buildings, roads and other improvements necessary to establish a capital city worthy of a great new southern nation, the ACT would not play the land grants game that Governor Arthur Phillip had played. Instead, land would be held by the ACT government, and private property holders would be granted leases of up to 99 years on the land and be obliged to pay a market rent annually to the government. In this way, certain private land speculators could not be favoured by the government, nor could they reap massive gains from the mere ownership of land. If James Roos had been a settler in Canberra in the 1920s instead of a convict in the 1790s, he could not have received 20 years' wages as a gift from the governor. Those gains would have accumulated to the government, reducing the tax burden on others. The land title system in Canberra has worked remarkably well, even though it was never implemented as perfectly as it was planned. Land rents were not adjusted frequently enough to avoid speculation in the land market, and landholders made speculative gains by reselling their leases that had annual rental obligations far below the current market. I hope you've enjoyed this sample from the audiobook Rigged. To hear the full book, please subscribe to Fresh Economic Thinking.